So I'm Avi Penhollow, and this is the Proximity Portal podcast. I'm here with Jason McNair, my partner on this show. And well, as our first episode, we plan to get into all kinds of stuff. Mostly, what are the things that we bring to this world that are not on other podcasts, or if they are, we feel that we have another angle on. And one of them would be information, how we perceive information, how we get our information, and the power of language, and how language determines our reality in many, many ways. And both Jason and I come at this from similar perspectives, and we have some obviously unique perspectives as well that we'll be exploring and bouncing off each other. Jason and I have a history. We share common lineage spiritually, and but intellectually we have a lot in common as well. And I know that this show is going to be a lot of fun for some of you who want to start thinking differently in order to empower yourself to have more agency in this world, to have more ability to what I think we would talk about this linguistic or communication dexterity.
Yeah.
And it's not just about winning arguments or pushing a particular political ideology on this show. It is about exploring the ideas and exploring truth, and not to be oversimplified, but not to be overcomplicated as well. That what are the boundaries of truth? What are things that we can know without necessarily becoming philosophical majors in the process? But your perspective is determined a lot by the context in which you were born, the language that you speak, those that are around you, and those you choose to be around. And multiple perspectives is very important in order to expand your perception of reality, if that's something you're willing or wanting to do.
Yeah.
So Jason, we're in the business of expanding people's horizons because we're in the business of expanding our own.
Yeah. And I think that we come to these conversations with the understanding that from our various discourse communities, as you mentioned that term earlier, there are some that will naturally harmonize, even though they may come from different perspectives or different angles. And there's some that will naturally, from the onset, conflict. And there's some where there's opportunity for growth and development, and some will take a little bit more working it out, I think also one of the big things that we're trying to seek to do with this podcast is to understand that those perspectives inform how we act. And that's ultimately one of the most important things from this. Like, what we expose ourselves to, what we're being influenced by, determines how we act and what really practically takes place, that affects our everyday lives.
Being doers of the word.
Not just hearers only. Yeah.
What is the word? Yeah.
Right. I'm going to come a lot from what I would consider to be esoteric, metaphysical, mystical side. I study Hermeticism. I truly believe in the first Hermetic principle, which states that all is mind, the universe is mental. And I think that whatever the majority of us can believe is what will be. Now, that's a phrase, why is that? Because if we all subscribe to it, then that's what will be. Then the question becomes, what can we all agree upon? What can we all accept together? We call that, I guess, a social contract. And I think it's about time in this age and season, that looks like a new social contract is inevitable. It's going to happen. So we're going to be trying to navigate through that in real time as it happens, because I truly accept the notion and the belief that it's going to happen. So
I think how that process plays out is largely going to be determined by how conscious
yeah,
we are in entering into having the discussion in the first place. Because right now, we're always dealing with issues of power. And anytime you're talking about language, you're going, and beliefs and ideologies and developing any sort of social contract, you're dealing with issues of power. And so my perspective then would be, we share a lot of spiritual and metaphysical understandings of things. And then the language, though, that we speak is going to be different, which I think is great, because I think that they inform each other. So my language is probably going to be a little more from the, say, linguistic or literacy, using terms like that to conceptually explain the same things, just using different. But I would say even more so, the term I revert to most of the time is consciousness. And what do we mean by that? And those are going to be some of the things that we explore too, is like, well, what does consciousness have to speak to the situation? Some people might say, well, what would God have to say about this, or think that, and we're going to be talking about theological things. We're going to be talking about philosophical, metaphysical, social issues, all of those things about what you just referred to as the emerging social contract, which I agree with you. I think it's inevitable. I think people will go kicking and screaming about this, but the bottom line is we occupy the same space, and we either need to develop some common terms without abusing language in the sense of creating terms as pejoratives. We'll get into that in this show. And we need, most of all, the intent behind our language to be pure and honest. So I think that every person on the planet, if you were to sit them down and to strip away the ideological aspects of language, which isn't impossible to do, by the way, but get to, well, what is it? What is it that this person behind this language, or behind this mind, or behind this context, like, really wants? Maybe it's a way of saying, what does your soul really want? And we're all in that. And so the conversations that Jason and I are going to have on the Proximity Portal have everything to do with pretty much every aspect of life that you can think about. We're not just going to sit and debate the latest political ideology of the day. We want to go beyond and transcend that and really look into what's behind all of that. Does that mean I don't have a political ideology? Of course not. And I'll be very upright and front about what my politics are on particular issues. And I'm sure, Jason, you'll do the same.
Most definitely.
But our goal for this show is to create proximity, or more, maybe a better way to put it would be to reveal the proximity that already exists. And on a metaphysical level, it would be even closer than we can perceive of.
Good breath.
So, with that, we invite you to join us in proximity. Absolutely.
It was one of the first things that really sobered me up when it came to my journey into Orthodoxy or Eastern Christianity. You see how I make those distinctions, right? It's because of dealing with those characters. I'll say characters. We all have the roles and characters that we play. They're dealing with those characters.
Absolutely. And we'll have some of those characters on the show.
That's funny. Yeah. Yeah, but now, as of today, I've been studying astrology. Can you believe that? Astrology and astrotheology since 2017. So for the past 3 years, I would consider myself beginner to intermediate, though the people who I associate around me, my friends and family, they would say, oh man, you're an expert. No, I don't think so. That's because of the standards that I set for myself. I'm an Aquarius. And then there's so much that I think, well, the sun is an Aquarius, I'll say it like that. There's so much that I think that I haven't perfected, or there's so much more information that I could gain to make myself even more proficient. But in that study, because I truly do just believe that astrology is a language of symbols that helps one to move towards self-discovery. I'm not talking about newspaper tabloid astrology here. I'm talking about a deep investigative study. In the East, they call it Vedic astrology. In the West, it's tropical astrology. And I'm also a Freemason. I became a Freemason. Hold on.
That's right. I saw that in a photo yesterday.
They make that distinction as well. A Prince Hall Freemason, not a part of any clandestine organization or,
You sure?
Bogus bootleg. Yeah, I can tell by the initiation fee. That was part of the. Yeah, those who are Masons will know what that means.
Maybe we could talk about how we met. You already mentioned it parenthetically. The connection that we have between each other is through Archbishop Varon Ash, known as Mar Enoch in our tradition, who we're going to do a whole slew of probably shows about him. I plan to interview people that talk about him, that knew him in person, that worked with him, things like that. And then I'll also interview people who may not have been as close to him, but were affected by, I get emails and inquiries still, on a weekly basis, and for those of you who don't know, Archbishop Varon Ash was a pretty dynamic character. I wouldn't call him famous, but he was definitely semi-famous and pretty popular in certain church circles, I would say.
Yep.
So he was on television. He's preached at the Azusa. What is it? The Azusa.
Bishop Carlton Pearson had annually an Azusa revival, or Azusa conference. They sort of like an ode to the original 1905, 1906, 1907 Azusa Street revivals.
Yeah. And that was about the time that I came in contact with him, and I'll tell that story another time. But essentially, he was a Pentecostal preacher and charismatic preacher for many years. He's got a really interesting story. We'll do a whole show just on his biographical background.
Yeah.
And then in the mid to late 90s, he discovered Eastern Orthodoxy. And so he began that journey. It's a little different to begin that journey as an individual as opposed to with a congregation. And there are many who have made that journey as a congregation. And there's books out there that talk about those accounts. We'll talk about those books and those accounts at some point. With a relatively, there's a spectrum there, though, that's usually not mentioned in those books of how that process plays out. And then when I met you, though, was pretty much, I think it was right after or right before Archbishop Varon Ash passed away.
Yeah.
And that would have been in January
of 2015. I think 2014, December. I remember the picture. I'm sure you talk about this too, the conversations that you had, or make some allusion to them. The picture, he's bald at this point, and he has on a sport coat, an open shirt, and you're standing right next to him. And I think you said you guys walked and talked all that night. That had to be the Christmas of 2014, I believe.
I know for a fact that it was because I went and picked him up at the hospital, and they gave him sort of a secret pass out of the hospital for us to go to a Christmas party with some friends. So
right. So I think January, by February or so, he was gone. Of 2015. Is that right?
I'm pretty sure that's right.
Yeah,
And
that's right. No, because that was the time. It's unique because that was the time that I'm in seminary. I'm, as Bishop Carlton Pearson would say, I'm asking questions and questioning answers. And I am feeling inquisitive and uncomfortable with a lot of the boundaries and limitations and restrictions that I have interpreted to that I have understood as being taught to me from my faith tradition of my upbringing. And so I'm pressing back at this time. And then in drops Bishop Ash and his teachings, and from looking at the YouTube clips, and I'm like, oh my goodness, I need to meet this person. I want to be connected with. That sort of came out of me. I emanated from my heart. And then it was actually Vane Thomas who actually inboxed me and said, hey, I see you posting a lot on Facebook, I see you posting a lot of the quotes of Bishop Ash, and you really are, being affected by his teachings. I'm trying to get connected with the people who he's connected to. I could connect you as well. And so he connected me with you.
I remember that.
And from there, here we are, some 5 years later.
I mean, it's hard to believe it's that short of a time, and it's hard to believe it's that long of a time.
Right, because it seems like we've been associated with each other forever, so, and in some ways, perhaps we have,
Absolutely.
Yep.
We'll wander into all these territories. That's
Sure will. Sure will.
So that's actually one of the things. So how we met was through shortly after he passed. I was in the middle of, it's a long story, but we hadn't seen each other in a long time. And he called me, I'd say about a year before this all happened, let me know that he was dealing with some health issues and that he'd like to see me. And at this point I had relocated, Denver, Colorado. I was ending my tenure in Denver, Colorado. And so when I flew out there, that's when we reconnected, because we had been sort of doing our own thing for about 5 years prior to that, 4 or 5 years. And that reconnection was good for so many things. I'll talk about that some other time. But, we had a really thorough reconciliation about some issues that we had some differences on. We talked about the future. And after 6 months or so of that, we finally lost Archbishop Ash. And that's when I was in the midst of putting all these things together, not only putting together, the memorial service, but sort of gathering the flock, so to speak, and reconnecting with former clergy. And some of us, the first time we had seen each other in years would have been at the memorial service itself. And then I remember meeting you. I remember meeting Vane and Nicholas O'Rourke. So Father Ishak. Yeah. But there was something about you guys, and that made me realize this is no mistake. This is no coincidence that that you guys came into my life right at that point, and into our lives as our church family, and so that's how we met. And then we just started having a lot of conversations by phone. It's been 5 years, but I feel like I've, known you my whole life, and perhaps, beyond. Right.
I think in those beginning days, as I look back on it now in hindsight, I think now looking back, we were filling you up. We were pouring back into you with our ambition and with our fire. It was almost like the energy of Mari Knock was flowing through us collectively, us threefold corporate. Yep. And kind of just like, because what we would do is spend time talking to you about the ideas and concepts and his theology and and orthodox theology and philosophy and asking questions and pontificating and, philosophizing and, just being really inquisitive and ambitious and coming to insights and even, just on the phone, just having these aha moments, that in and of itself is very Veron-esque.
Right. It is.
Call that a word.
Veron-esque.
So I think that kind of really helped you to get the wheels turning and flowing. And I think since that time, there has been an exchange. I think that as we did for you in the beginning, I know I can speak for myself most definitely, because I think of the three, just speaking honestly, I think you and I are probably the closest. Well, we speak the most frequently. I can say that out of the three of us. And I know most definitely in my life, I have felt, especially now, a sense of balance from all of the churchiness. I'm going to say that's the word. That's the immediate word that comes to me.
The dualities of the institution and esoteric or mystical thought. That's how I would put it. Yeah.
Yes.
And all of the claims made about those issues. Yeah.
Yeah. I feel that. I feel what I would call the relaxation of that balance. I think this is great that I could speak freely like that. And I want to say that you feel free to interpret and translate like you just did. I think that really helps, most definitely, because I trust you with my thoughts. I do.
No, it's mutual.
I trust you with the understanding of my thoughts and the way that you can articulate them in a way. Very, very seldom or very, very rarely do you articulate the thoughts that I am thinking and the way that I express them. And I say, no, not quite. I don't think I've ever done that. Like, you say it and I'm like, yeah, exactly. Those are the technical terms. Or because I'm sitting here even as I'm thinking, and I'll stop and I'll let you weigh in on this. There's so much in my mind that I want to say at one time, because I can hear the many questions, nuanced questions that people could be asking themselves even as they listen to this very podcast, and it's like, I want to address all those questions, but right. It's like, I can't address, and I want to address them all at once, and I can't address them all at once.
Oh, I think
I know that they're there.
I think we're in the same boat on that, and so part of the reason, I guess, if there's a stall to start, is just being overwhelmed with, well, I want to address this issue and that issue, but you also have to think about audience. Now there's the educators coming out of me. You have to think of your intended audience and, not just a virtual audience in that sense. When I teach writing, for example, one of the tricks of teaching writing is to be able to overcome this idea that the teacher is the audience. And so to have a real audience, many times with students, what you want to do is give an assignment where actually there will be readers or viewers of their content. Mm-hmm. And it changes the dynamic when you're speaking your thoughts, when you're thinking. Now, there's, of course, traps. You can fall into thinking too much, watching your words too much, as opposed to the other end of the spectrum.
And I'm doing that right now, as a matter of fact. I feel myself watching my words too much.
This is one of the issues that we're going to talk about is
most definitely
information dissemination and consumption. And because those are directly related to what I think is the impetus for the show, and that would be perception and reality.
Yes.
Like I said earlier, how information is, distributed, created, distributed, and consumed, and how those affect everything that's going on right now. We're living in the time of, COVID-19. And if I hear the words, the new normal, or if I hear the words, in these unprecedented times and that kind of thing anymore, you think I pull my hair out. Right. So,
exactly.
But on the show, one of the things I'm interested in exploring is first of all, just getting multiple perspectives on various issues, and not just pundit multiple perspectives. And by that, I just mean you have the pundits politically aligned on the right and the left, and there's really no room in between. The right will talk about something called cancel culture.
Oh my goodness.
And then the left, and political correctness. And then on the left, in a lot of times they will practice the same exact techniques, tactics, modalities, and we just label them different things.
Yes.
So we'll look at those nuances together as well.
One of the concepts that I want to talk about, I know I'll be wanting to talk about, is synonymity. Synonymity to me is, it's magical. What do I say? It's magical. Synonym is the concept that you can take a word and have another word is similar in meaning, but not the exact same. And why is that important? Synonymity is married to connotation. And what's connotation? I understand connotation as how the word makes the person feel by what they perceive it means. And you can say the same sentence using, and I've done this before in my journal. I've written a sentence, and then I've written another sentence underneath it by going onto Google and clicking on synonyms and finding a synonym for every individual word in that sentence, and then finding another synonym for every individual word in that sentence, and find another synonym for every, and you end up with these like 4 or 5 sentences that essentially, by definition of what synonyms are, would be saying similar things, but can be taken very differently. Yeah. And to me, the fact that that exists, oh my goodness, is it helpful or is it harmful? Because I'm able to, at that point, stand over top of it all, stand detached from it all, and say, I really see what's going on here.
Well, you just put down a lot of stuff. And of course, as a literacy and language instructor and researcher, like, right. Yes, of course. I would start the school year just saying, well, what are we here for? What's the purpose of English language arts, for example? And that's for other episodes, I'll bring in people on that.
Right.
But on the topic of synonymity, because I didn't know what you were talking about at first. Right. And so then I just sort of hung back, and then I sort of caught what you're talking about. And yeah, that's the whole power of language. It's both the blessing and the curse. It's the limitation and the potentiality of everything we have is through language, right? Yeah. They'll say, language is power and that kind of thing. And of course that's more true than I think people even realize.
Yes.
And, we articulate concepts that way. And I think when you're talking about synonymity and how it allows us more flexibility in discovering the nuances of articulating a concept, I guess, and then finding, conceptual resonance within the anticipated other, right? The other person hearing what you're talking about and communicating. And you can do that on multiple levels. You can do it on, that exercise that you were just describing. It's kind of fascinating to me as I might want to try that with my students, if I was still in the classroom, right? Let's try this. I've done similar things before, but never sort of what I would call like a parallel sentence. I definitely have done rephrasing exercises with students, but choosing synonyms for every word that you can. Of course, articles like the, but, and you're gonna probably
find some limitations there, but right.
But I know what you're talking about. Is every word that's indicating a concept.
Yes,
it can be used definitely that way. And then I was thinking while you're talking about that, about the biblical, like in the book of Psalms, for example, it's very common, of course, in the Hebrew, to do couplets.
Yep.
where a statement will be made and then the statement will be rephrased, saying exactly the same thing, but just
Yes.
rephrasing it. And that's one of the beautiful parts, I think, of certain aspects of biblical language, right?
Yeah.
But what is it doing is like the question that goes on in my brain. And
Yes.
what is the language doing?
Yes.
And what's behind it, right? And
Yes.
so I'm not going to get into my biography right now, but so I'm currently, this is the first broadcast, right? On my end, we're both in two different locations, but we're much more in proximity now physically than
Right.
we were just a few weeks ago,
Right.
where I was living in Hawaii for the last 4 years, and teaching in most recently in Honolulu. And then now I'm in Columbia, Missouri. So I decided in my old age, I'm going back to finish a PhD. This time, though, in the title of the PhD program is Language and Literacies for Social Transformation.
Mm-hmm.
So implicit, and of course, in that description, is language is power, and it's related to, they translate into very real things. I mean, so that'll be another avenue that we pursue on this show is talking about all these different voices and how they represent. I mean, we haven't even talked about different languages yet, but going back to synonymity,
Right.
then you have the nuances of each genius of each language.
Right.
And so those who study the Bible, for example, who really study the Bible, not just on the literal level, but on the textual level of understanding it.
Criticisms.
Criticisms,
Criticism,
hermeneutics.
contextual criticism, literary
Exactly.
criticism. Yes.
Exactly. All that stuff, we learn in seminary and those things are extremely important to extracting meaning. Then on the literary side itself, outside of even biblical interpretation, there is all sorts of what I call, well, I don't call them, we call them critical lenses in the field. There are many lenses you can wear when you look at a text.
Yeah.
That's how we describe it for students. So like, let's say you put on these lenses and now let's view this text through the gender lens, for example.
Right.
And explore this text. The one I do I do the social power lens a lot when we're reading a text. And we use all sorts of different lenses when you're looking at a text so that you can see it from different perspectives. Now, some people would reject that because they believe in this idea of a static communication, that what is the author's intended message is all that matters.
Yeah.
Right. For example.
Right.
But sometimes understanding that author's message or communication, you also need to understand through these lenses of, well, what biases what did the author have?
Yeah.
And how did their cultural conditioning play into that? So all of these facets of language ideology are going to come into play, but they're not being talked about on most shows that address social issues. We don't talk about it. We definitely use language tactics and rhetorical tactics to win arguments generally. And I'm not going to say that I don't try to win arguments, but I'm more interested in knowing the intent behind somebody's words, the intent behind someone's actions, both individually and collectively. And this is where you're going to lose people because some people only view things from the individual standpoint. So, I mean, I don't even want to get into it, but well, yeah, I do. So if you say racism, one of the big rifts right now in understanding and perception that I see as I analyze the dialogue through podcasts, media, personal conversations, is this idea that, well, what is a racist in the first place? And the idea that it is a personal feeling of dislike towards a particular group of people, or nastiness on the part of an individual towards a group of people. And that's one example of, say, a personal overt racism.
Mhm.
But it doesn't address a lot of the other things that are very real in society. So then the other concept about language that I think we'll go for in this show is intended meaning versus interpreted meaning.
Yeah.
How different Foucault calls this discourse communities. This is where silos come from, where people are just talking within their own group.
Yeah.
So you referred to one of them earlier with
Yep.
what I would call like Christianese or churchianity
Yep.
is one of them. But every single ideological camp has their own discourse community.
Mm-hmm.
And so, in this show, I plan to really try to dig into some of those things and to kind of rip them open a little bit and look at
Yeah.
them. I think people are ready. I think people are ready for transcending this really two-dimensional consumer media that's out there.
Yep.
Now, do I believe that consumer media is going anywhere? Absolutely not. I consume a lot of it myself. But at the same time, I think people are ready to move beyond this.
Yep.
In a conversation the other day, this is the last thing I'll say about language. A conversation the other day, we talked about where we're at in society right now. So not only are we, the reason we're wanting to move past this is I think everybody realizes at this point that our lives have a context. And then there's an immediate context, and then there's a greater context.
Yep.
The immediate context, would be the family you're born into, your social class, your ethnicity, all that kind of stuff. The greater context, of course, would be the greater society, the things that determine what are our quote unquote societal values. And generally those are determined by what's called the culture of power, or the dominant culture in that sense. And so in the United States, this is why we'll talk a lot about white supremacy and all those kind of things. But what I'm interested in, one of the issues I'm interested in is, what is our social contract, right? So we're here, we're born into this situation. We definitely need to analyze history. We need to do everything in our power to really penetrate the meanings of that history, deconstruct that history from multiple perspectives instead of just one dominant narrative. And then as we're in the present, realizing our own situation, the situation we're all in, both individually and collectively. But even more than that, by doing so, we're able to look forward. So one of the questions I'm really mostly interested in, despite everything, I'm not interested in sweeping anything under the rug historically and presently in order to get to some glittery future. But I do think it's important to ask people, what are the outcomes that we want?
Yeah.
What are the outcomes that we want individually? Usually in consumer media, it goes towards the individual, usually from a materialistic perspective. But that's not actually what I'm talking about. I'm talking about a more holistic Maslow's hierarchy of needs sort of way. Like what is it that we want? What is it that we want for ourselves, and what do we want for society? And I think that when you pose the question that way, and you say to a person who ideologically on the political spectrum is opposite of you, what if you say, well, what do you want? And then they immediately say something, well, I want to get rid of the Democrats, or I want to get rid of the Republicans. Well, let's refrain from even using those terms when I ask, what is it that we want as a society? What is it that we can come together and all agree on that we want? Instead of telling each other what the other wants, what are some basics that we all can agree on? That's a starting point. It might sound oversimplistic, but I think it's a good one. What are the outcomes that we're looking for? And so one of them for me is, I would like to explore the possibility of writing together a new social contract. Now the problem, though, of course, is that if you come, quote unquote, to the table with a list of prerequisites, it's going to be very hard to accomplish if everybody does that. So for me, this is just one big idea that I want to explore. That is, what can we put on the table that's not too generalized? Like, we want love and peace, that kind of thing. But concrete ideas that we can all agree on. So if we say the word safety, what do we mean by that? And let's make that list together, and let's circle the ones that we can all agree on, even if we can't agree on how to get there ourselves. So I went way off the rails on that.
No, you didn't. Because I have a lot of thoughts to follow up from that, and so I don't think you went off on the rails at all. Let me jump in.
Yeah.
Because I was talking to you a while back, and I was asking the question. Well, first of all, speak to a couple of things. For the astrologers out there who listen to this, you'll know that Uranus is transiting in Taurus. And what is Taurus about? Values. What is Uranus about? It's about sudden change, right? So there's this sudden change of values that is taking place currently right now. And so even to the extent of maybe we need to write a new social contract. The last time that there was this particular planetary setup, it was the American Revolution, like the first one. Like my daughters were watching Hamilton the other day on Disney Plus, the new musical that's out. And so I was like, it's interesting that now in this time they release Hamilton, because that's what the whole thing is about the structuring and founding of this country and how it's all coming together. And Disney releases that right, and we're going through this almost like a modernized version of that, And so that, coupled with my Hermetic beliefs, the first Hermetic principle, which is the all is mind, universe is mental. And I think that statement right there is something that's not self-evident to a lot of people, that the universe is mental, that the all is mind first. They don't really know, like, what does that mean? That means, as I understand it, that whatever the majority of us can accept and believe is what will be. And so that is practically seen, or it's fleshed out in things like writing a social contract. And how can we take all these different perspectives, I'll say, like on the zodiac wheel, for example, you have two perspectives that what they call square each other naturally, meaning they naturally cause tension. You have others who trine each other, which means that they naturally cause harmony, like a Libra and Aquarius, two air signs. The archetypes, archetypally speaking, they're in harmony with one another, as opposed to like Aries, the aggressive Aries, and the soft nurturing Cancer, which square each other, naturally square each other. So how do you give voice to all of those different, how do you create space for those different voices and have them be honored, knowing that there may be some preset conflicts or preset harmonies that exist between them by nature, just naturally, as without them doing anything, at rest. These things.
I think I just want to interject real quick, because
go ahead.
A thought that came to my mind then would be, what you're doing right now is first of all, being aware of what those issues are. Most people, when they're coming to the table, especially when talking about political ideology, we already know what those are.
Right.
But in a sense, you almost need a mediator to a certain extent, who, or some sort of mediating facilitation, maybe not even personalized, but some sort of mechanism that recognizes these without propensities, without pigeonholing people in a certain sense. Because of course, I know you can go on to the nuances of how these things can be muted and transmuted and all that sort of thing. So there is a need then for some sort of conceptual platform that already understands these pre-existing divergences and dynamic relationships of how things work,
right?
In order for it to work. So I think that's pretty fascinating. Even though I just wanted to also say, like, I have no idea about most of this stuff, because the astrological side is just not my area. I've had lots of friends.
So interesting.
Huh?
This
Right,
whole
right.
interaction is probably never before been seen and going to be very much so interesting. It's very Aquarian in this Aquarian age that we're in now of the proliferation of information. If you know about Aquarius, Aquarius is all about the information superhighway. We are in that age now. And as an Aquarius or son of Aquarius myself, one of the first things that I notice is the need to pull back and ground yourself in silence. Because a lot of the things that you'll probably talk about or that you'll bring guests on, I purposely won't read the information. I won't receive the information. And it's not because I seek to be uninformed or I want to be, or that I'm unintelligent. It's not the case at all. I just want to be able to bring my raw reason and my raw intellect to the table, because I think that that would serve the purpose of what we're trying to do here best, because it's going to be raw Jason. It won't be like saturated with, the influence of however what I read made me feel.
I'm at that space too in my life where there's all kinds of dogmatism out there. And there's a fine line, working in an academia is just as filled with rules and regulations and ideological rules and regulations. One of the accusations sometimes is when you say, well, all things should be able to be discussed. You have this sort of policing that comes and saying, well, but not everything's equal. And I agree with that. Not everything is equal. I'm not going to sit and listen to the logic of someone who's, flat out bigoted on particular issues as if that's an equal position to someone who's open-minded or who understands that the world is bigger than that particular limited ideology. That doesn't mean that ideology can't be discussed, however, and talked about, because I think it's important for people to understand those things.
No, I think that with everything that's spoken from the mouth, it's as if someone is casting a spell. I think when you seek to regulate, watch these words I'm going to use. It's going to be very Piscean how I say all this stuff and get ready to say. So when you regulate the person's ability to cast a spell, you also regulate the other person's ability to counteract that spell. What do I mean by spell? I mean the ability to influence behavior with words. That's what I mean by spell. Like spelling book, dictionary. I said the dictionary is one of the greatest spell books of all time. The dictionary. That's where you get your words that you can use to cast, to cause an influence, right? And so when you start to try to regulate that, then you also regulate the person's ability to counteract. Now, when we talk about ideas that may not necessarily be useful, I also think that there is a spirit behind an idea. And sometimes, and most times, all times, that spirit seeks to compound itself to grow that idea. And so if we have someone who's obviously bigoted, we already know what the spirit of those ideas that you're trying to cast upon us are. So we can cut those off at the pass. There's nothing else that's of any use to us because we know who you are. We see who you are. We're calling you out. So the conclusion is that you seek to compound hate or control or manipulation, and we don't want any of that. I've been in plenty of Facebook conversations where I've actually called out the actual, what I perceive to be the spirit of the idea of the person. I say, oh, this is fear, or this is, arrogance, or this is whatever the case may be, as I perceive it.
And you've got, so this is where I think things are going to be going with us, because you've just caused two different, really strong responses with me. And I lost the first one because you moved to a second one. And
Sorry.
The spirit of the, but so that happens to me too. And then there's a difference because as an individual, I enter into conversations or into any space with the various levels of consciousness. And what I mean by that is sometimes you're really focused on truly being a conscious being. And then there are times where you're an idiot, and 9 times out of 10, I'm in the idiot mode, just like anyone else.
Right.
And of course, for me, the goal of spirituality is to maximize the time that you are acting in full consciousness, meaning you're in full awareness of where you're sitting
Yes.
emotionally and all these other things. And I'm speaking to the part, because I lost the first one, about the intent behind, the spirit behind something.
Yeah.
Oh, remind me later. The other word is euphemism.
Euphemism.
Yeah. So for me, when I'm consciously entering into some sort of dialogue like that, and when you're dealing with a straight up nastiness or something where you know what it is, or let's say you identify this is fear.
Right.
Sometimes you can't speak that out loud
Yeah.
because you will immediately ignite or initiate the defense mechanism in the person, right?
Don't
Right.
call my name, Rumpelstiltskin. Who told you my name? Yeah.
So what I've learned slowly that is you pivot with that understanding, because now you have something, right? Okay, fear is behind what's being motivated here. And if you're willing to stay engaged in the conversation, then you just keep that, because you have something that they may not necessarily know even themselves.
Yeah.
They don't know that you know it.
Right.
And so you can actually change an entire conversation to be more productive by going and addressing those issues. So
Yeah.
I have conversations with some very unlikely folks. I can't have too much of it because I'm not at that level yet, I guess, where I could do it all the time.
Understood.
But I have a few select ones that I have conversations with for that purpose. And I've seen it work. I've seen it work extremely well. And when you get to the point where you start talking past one another or reverting into the ideological language, that's when you know to back off and pivot.
The spells aren't working.
And with these, yeah, exactly. And when with these dialogue partners is what I call them, with a dialogue partner, they recognize those cues. And once they establish that trust with you in the relationship, and they see that you're not willing to go, you're not going to respond in kind. You're going to remind each other, really, that it's about the relationship, and the purpose, of course, would be about maintaining the relationship for the projected outcome that you desire, which would be finding some synonymity and harmonious, resonance with each other, despite how ugly some things might be, on the surface, and then not to diminish the fact that they are.
Yes.
What I meant about euphemism was, yeah, you could spot a bigot pretty easily, like someone who's like overtly so.
Right.
The real danger right now is, with this power of language, is that those who clean up that act, but they have the same intent, and as far as they create words, terms, phrases, tactics, and they do it in a very intelligent way. And basically they create new euphemisms, which are really pejoratives in disguise.
Yes.
It's interesting that we have only mentioned the one who is mentioned way too often in the media, and is probably occupies the space that he does because of it.
Right.
But here I think there's an illustrative example. The other day, President Trump tweeted the euphemism cancel culture.
Yeah.
And it's interesting because when he comes around to catching on to something like that, you know that a word has permeated society pretty well in that sense. And of course, now that term has been appropriated. Once he appropriates a word, he redefines that word, and everyone will use the word right or left according to his definition. That is an incredible amount of power.
I was going to say the same thing.
Human being, to allow that person to appropriate language, and to redefine it and redistribute it. And if there is, because I don't consider Trump to be a very intelligent individual, but I will say he definitely understands the power of manipulating
Wow, that's the power of I think that's futuristically speaking, I think that may be the real power of the office moving
Well,
forward.
and if, and in a
Maybe it
sense,
always has been.
exactly, I was going to say, in a sense, sorry, I had to move my, in a sense, that has always been the case. I mean, once that term's, I just want to go back to the point that once that term is appropriated by him and the incredible amount of power that's given, we can come up with a whole list of other terms. Well, he's done it before with
Right,
fake news. Fake
right,
news was not a Trump concept
right.
at the beginning, in the sense that fake news meant something. That being said, I think the insidious nature of euphemism in this case would be when you are intentionally appropriating language and changing its meaning and twisting. It's sort of like, you know what I think?
Witchcraft.
It is witchcraft. Yeah, I was thinking of something much more ridiculous, like
I'm going to give all those mystical wordy words, and that's coming from where I am right now in life, and
but
that may change 5 years from now, like it changed 5 years ago. And now this would be I'll end with this. I think that if you want to find a place where we can step back from the flow of information and be grounded, I'll say that word, and actually look at it and observe it without necessarily being fully submerged in it, I think you found your podcast, because I most definitely myself am going to be one of the ones who intentionally, because of my level of sensitivity, my empathic nature, for those in New Age culture would call it that, my Pisces ascendant, and astrologers would refer to it as, because of my sensitivity of my nature, I'm going to be one who steps back anyway. So if you're looking for that podcast where it's like, okay, let's talk about some of the things that are in the flow of information right now, stepping back from them and not necessarily being fully hypnotized.
well, we're going to talk a lot about, I mean, the power of language, the
Yeah,
power of and information is always going to be carried across the medium of language.
yeah,
The spoken word, the written word, the visual, all of these things are symbolic representations of concepts.
yeah.
And we want our audience to just increase, just as we're doing, increase their awareness
Yeah,
that language often determines the reality that we're in.
yes,
We are all conditioned by our language
yes.
ideology, our dialects, uh, our geographic location, and the socio-political context.
Hip hop.
So, yeah, exactly. I mean, hip hop is one of the most profound, and it's been looked at uh, as one of the more great case study
Yeah,
in them in new ways, creating a whole new mediums out of it. I'm thinking
right.
just of the turntable itself,
Yes,
and that dynamic between spoken word and even how that dynamic changed over time. Like it used to be, of course, the DJ had the more prominent position,
right.
and the MC was
MC.
later elevated to these
That's
things.
correct. Yeah,
These are all the stuff that like fascinate me, because
yeah,
it's to me, there's no more powerful medium in the world right now than hip hop, of course. The point here is that whether you like it or not, and what you think, feel, respond to, your beliefs, whether you like it or not, are predetermined by the discourse communities that you were born into, and what you're willing to engage in,
yeah.
which in my view it makes you empowered. The more you can increase your awareness of multiple perspectives, it doesn't mean that you necessarily take on those perspectives. If you speak more than one language, if you're fluent in another language, you have a greater perception of concepts, in the sense
Yes.
of that there's more than one way to think about things
Oh,
in
yes.
nuanced ways that cannot be expressed particularly specifically in one language. If you speak fluently in at least two languages, you know that you have different perspectives on a thing, a
Oh,
concept.
yeah.
But your
Yeah.
perceptions will increase the more you're willing to put yourself in a position where you're able to transcend your own context
Yes.
in order to engage in other contexts. It's liberating. There's nothing like the feeling of realizing that you don't have to be stuck in the mindset that you always were.
Yeah.
And that
Yeah.
does not mean that everything you thought is wrong.
Right.
This is the other side of that coin, is people get afraid. There's a fear behind, allowing
Yeah.
other realities to share your space,
Or they throw the baby out with the bathwater. I've had friends who've converted religions, and all they can do now is bash their former religion because they feel nothing but deception. It's almost like a bait and switch. It's like they feel like they get this new piece of information that replaces the old information, but typically because they've lost the debate. and then so they feel as if they're just so deceived, and then they spend the majority of their time at this point just trying to disprove their former religion and feeling deceived. It's just the spirit of deception, I call it, that comes over them, and it doesn't really like add to that person. It just
it splits their consciousness into
yes.
The either or.
Yep.
And to the very unhealthy extent where you're just creating a dualistic life for the rest of your life, and any contradictions to that are dealt with pretty much by denial and cognitive dissonance. And I don't want to live life like that. I want to live a life that is open and free, not into the sense of that there are no conceptual boundaries or there are no conceptual realities that we can grasp with language. We just have to always put before us this sort of, I don't want to call it a duality because it's not, but that, both the power and limitation of language.
Yeah, most definitely.
And
I think even something neurologically happens to someone, and you can correct me if I'm wrong. I think something even neurologically in the brain chemistry is different for those who are bilingual than for those who just speak one language. I think it even does something to the neural processors, for someone who can speak fluent Spanish and English as opposed to someone who can only speak English or only speak Spanish, So I think even that is an elevation of consciousness. So it may not always be I think that concept can transcend just language, and it can also be with concepts. If you're able to step outside of your your discourse community and speak bilingually in that paradigm, in that context, you can speak in this discourse community and in this discourse community and understand both without having to throw one out for the other.
You have more communication dexterity.
I like that. Yeah.
Yes. And there's different levels to this stuff. There's some people, for example, I discovered this first, of course, from the religious, from hermeneutical side of things, when you get your Strong's Concordance and you learn how to break down Greek and Hebrew words. Well, that doesn't make me fluent in that language, but it definitely informs me of the nuance that, number one, the Bible wasn't written in English. It was written in our languages, not just Greek and Hebrew, by the way. But the more of those terms that you become familiar with and you understand that there's nuances, and more you can understand the cultural context of the language of the Bible, right? And then the more you broaden your understanding of something. Unless the spirit behind it, of course, is you're trying to already defend your ideological presuppositions about what it means. The goal of reaching into language should be to transform always, though, to transform your understanding of whatever it is that you're encountering. So the first one was that, looking up Greek and Hebrew words and pulling them into the understanding I have of the text that I was reading in English, because I'm not fluent in Greek and Hebrew. And of course, the next step is to get fluent in Greek and Hebrew, and then you can elucidate the ideas even more in your native tongue.
That's right.
But beyond that, then the other side of it that I learned that through was through yoga, which I'm sure I'll be bringing in a lot of yogic perspectives in our conversations as well. Well, I did the same thing in yoga as I
found myself sitting up straight. As soon as you said the word yoga, I found myself lifting my back and sitting up straight.
I'm still recouping from my 8-hour drive to 2 days ago, so I'm pretty slouched right now myself.
Mm.
But in yoga, what you learn is that, there's just some things you can't say in English. You can, it just takes longer. But there's a word for that in Sanskrit, that really goes to the heart of it. Or most recently in Hawaii, working with, in the context of Hawaii, there are Hawaiian words that just get right to the point of the spirit of what you want to say that resonates within that discourse community. So,
Right.
for example, I'm dealing with some really unsavory things right now with the school that I used to work at. And yes, I will be talking about that openly pretty soon. And there'd be a difference for me to say, what's going on here is extremely wrong and unethical.
Mm-hmm.
Or me saying, what you're doing right now is not Pono.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Pono.
That's hip hop to me, though. That's hip hop does that. Hip hop does that. Because if you be like, nah, I mean,
yeah.
It's like people. There's this new thing now. People they're like, say less, and say less sort of means like, I connect. I got it. I understand exactly what you mean on all the dimensions and all the levels that you mean it.
Right.
So they're like, say less. Yeah.
We're resonating. Keep going.
Yeah. Yes. Exactly.
We do this. And of course, I could probably, now I'm in the middle of Missouri, right?
Right.
Learning a brand new context. I feel, I feel really weird right now. This is just a personal anecdote that I'm still, and especially with COVID going on where you don't have like society. I mean, there's a lot of weirdness going on with that by itself.
Right.
But to be translated from my home environment for the last 4 years, in Hawaii, and to come here, it's been a culture shock for me in the sense, even though I'm a Midwestern boy originally,
right.
But like, and I mean, even something as basic as, man, there's a lot of white people here.
Yeah.
Well, why should I care? I mean, but at the same time, I'm like, I notice it, and there's just so many things like that I'm noticing, and it's really interesting to reintegrate back into. But so anyway, I'm in Columbia, Missouri, which is in the middle of the state. It's a university town, which means it's atypical of the state in general, which is primarily rural outside of St. Louis, Columbia, and Kansas City. Culturally and everything, it's very, very different from what I'm used to, the context that I'm in. But I think I'm right where I'm supposed to be. Right. And some of these encounters that I'm going to have, and I've already had, I'll probably tell a lot of stories about some of my encounters.
Yeah.
And but I'm excited about this show, Jason.
Me too. I am very much so. It's going to be exciting and informative and real life. What do I mean by real life? What's another way of me saying real life? I know it's not. We're not in it for celebrity status. I can say that I know that this is 100% an authentic endeavor to be truthful. It was Miles Monroe who I heard that said, what is truth? Truth is original information. The original information as is. That is the truth. And so, I think we're going to present as much of that as possible.
As simple and as profound as that statement is.
Yeah.
It's like it represents, an epitome of simplicity and extreme complicatedness at the same time.
At the same time.
But that's the world we live in, and that's what this show is about, right? It's going to be about penetrating those realities, and the purpose, if we're to state our own outcomes, one of the purposes I have is to get to the truth. Right. Not in a simplistic way that a lot of podcasts pretend to get to the truth by, death by euphemism, pejoratives, and defeating the enemy through your own silo. But this truly, I think, will be a way to dialogue about stuff that makes you think about things in ways that you wouldn't have before it started. And for me, thinking about things in different ways has always led to more liberation, more emancipation on every level, with physical, spiritual, mental, all those sorts of things. And just to be liberated, not from necessarily, but toward greater consciousness, greater agency is a word I like to use all the time. To have agency means you are empowered to be able to do more in whatever domain or modality that you're working in. So even though we might be talking about a particular issue, the great thing about conversations about this is you can take away from that conversation and apply it. The application of the information will allow you to get to the bottom of things that might have troubled you for decades, or things that you never thought about before that now emerge and allow you to be liberated from something you didn't even know you needed liberation from.
Correct.
Or toward, because I prefer toward when we talk about liberation. You know, it's one thing to defeat whatever oppressing force there is, but it's like, you know, where do we go from here? And
you know, I'm thinking about that, and as you were talking, I was thinking about, even on a metaphysical level, there are times where I've gone back in my own past and talked to my younger self. What do I mean by that?
No, it's a great exercise.
I revisited old situations in my imagination and course corrected, if I want to call it that, and I felt the effects of it in the present.
Isn't that weird?
You know, so that just speaks to the power of, you know, as you were speaking about revisionism, about how that really can have real life effects.
I would say that we'll leave everybody with some homework then, those that are listening to this meandering conversation that we've had. The topics will emerge, as I know. I mean, we will have very specific topics that we're going to, and we'll be listing those. But the homework I would give for today would be, let's try that exercise. Take some time at home, when you're not distracted, and sit with yourself and pretend and visualize, or do whatever it takes to get yourself in that space where you can see yourself at a particular age. There are different ways to approach this, of course. You could do it a particular event in your life and that memory of that event. And then you go and visit yourself in that time period and talk to yourself at that time and have that conversation. And you'll be amazed at what starts to emerge from that. You don't try to force it, but you have that conversation with yourself. I think it's a profound exercise that I think there's more to it, as you were just pointing to, than just the exercise itself. I'm not willing to define that myself, but I find it also to be empowering. I've had some really powerful experiences with that. So that'll be the homework we leave for you. Spend some time, talk to your younger self. Then when you emerge from that conversation, write it down, or record it, and remember it, because those are going to be some powerful things. You know, there's a lot we're going to get into when it comes to our subconscious minds, and all of that kind of stuff. So it's all about perception. And proximity is about putting yourself in a relationship with everything that's around you. Proximity, you can have a proximity with your thoughts or a lack thereof. You can have a proximity with your spouse or a lack thereof. Jason and I are talking to each other probably 1,000 miles away. He's in Virginia. I'm in
the galaxy.
He is in the galaxy. And I'm in my bedroom in Colombia.
On the earth. I mean, but we're still close. Even those that, you know, we'll talk about that, how even though if those who can't see me, and my Zoom background is constellation or a galaxy, and so
mine is my bedroom.
But we're together, and we'll talk about what that really means on the multiple levels, that even though I'm way out here, figuratively speaking, and he's grounded on the earth, we're still together, still one. The commonality between those two things. So
and the medium of technology allows us to speak on a shared screen in real time, but at the same time there's also a proximity there that's even closer than the technology that is allowing this conversation to happen, so that you can all hear it, perceive it, and that has to do with our relationship that we have. And sometimes we'll utilize this technology, but more often than not, we don't. And that might be a little too esoteric and
No,
strange.
those who get that understood
But
that.
if you get it, you get it. Everyone's had that experience. You think of someone they call, or
Yeah, that's a good way of putting it.
and this happened to us yesterday or the day before.
Yep.
And it happens all the time. Where I'll
Synchronicity.
I like that.
There's the word. I threw it out.
Synchronicity is proximity. I like that.
Yeah, that was good.
Yeah, that's a perfect way to sign off on that.